Very well, Mr. Nielsen. Carry on.
Now, Professor Heyck, I would like to turn to the development and origins of sexual orientation. Now, because the term homosexuality encompasses many distinct phenomena, attempting to identify the origins of homosexuality and, more broadly, a sexual orientation is a different task, correct?
What I've said in my expert report and elsewhere is that there are many different theories about the origins of sexual orientation in general, not just homosexuality, but also heterosexuality. And there really is no consensus on what the origins are of a person's sexual orientation.
Well, please turn to tab 5 in the witness binder, if you would.
I'm sorry.
Please turn to tab 5 in the witness binder.
This is back in the bigger one?
Yes.
Okay.
And please look at page 151 in the second column, and please look under origins in the bottom of the first paragraph.
Yes.
And you are speaking about homosexuality. You say, because the term encompasses many distinct phenomena, however, attempting to identify the origins of homosexuality and, more broadly, sexual orientation is a difficult task, correct?
Yes, yes.
And those are your words.
Correct.
The factors that cause an individual to become heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual are not currently well understood, correct?
That is correct.
And the origins of sexual orientation, or why a particular person becomes heterosexual or gay or lesbian or bisexual, is an area where there has been a lot of discussion, a lot of dispute, correct?
That's correct.
And no compelling evidence has yet been offered to demonstrate clearly the origins of adult sexuality, correct?
That is correct.
Widely differing sources for adult sexual orientation have been proposed, but no single theory enjoys unequivocal empirical support, correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. It seems likely that a wide variety of biological, psychological, social, and cultural variables that contribute to sexual orientation will eventually be identified with different individuals arriving at their adult orientation in different ways, correct?
That's my speculation, and I believe it's accurate, but it's my speculation.
All right, thank you. And so is that your opinion?
Well, it's my hypothesis, I guess I would say. It's subject to revision in the light of different data, but at the moment, yes, I would say that's my opinion.
All right. And based on the data currently available, is that
correct?
Okay, thank you. Debates about the origins of sexual orientation have led to a more pluralistic view of human sexuality, correct?
Are those my words?
They are.
Just, can you tell me where they're from so I have context for it?
It's tab 6, if you like, and it's page 686.
Okay, under the origins of sexual orientation. This is from the Corsini Encyclopedia article, right?
Correct.
Okay.
So do you agree with that statement? Debates about the origins of sexual orientation have led to a more pluralistic view of human sexuality.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find out where you're reading from. I'm sorry, can you point me to the place on the page, or just which column or which paragraph?
Second column, second full paragraph. Can you find that?
Oh, the second full paragraph. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, yes, okay, I see it now, okay.
All right, thank you. Scientists are increasingly coming to appreciate that homosexuality and heterosexuality are not unitary phenomena, and that even in our own culture, different people develop and express their sexual orientation in different ways, correct?
Yes.
And based on these insights, no single theory seems likely to be able to explain the development of heterosexuality or homosexuality in all people, correct?
Correct.
Indeed.
That is my speculation. I mean, I'm saying that, but I believe it's accurate.
Okay, thank you. Indeed, some researchers have emphasized this view by framing their work in terms of heterosexualities and homosexualities, correct?
Right, and those have been mainly ways of trying to identify this diversity within those groups along the lines similar to what we discussed earlier, differences in age, race, and ethics, location, all sorts of things that contribute to differences and experiences of one's sexuality.
All right, thank you. And in this specific context, where you're talking about the origins, I assume you're talking about a variety of potential causes as well, correct?
Well, I do posit that, and I think that by the time we got to that last section of that paragraph, I was just pointing out that in studying, in not coming up with a single explanation for what causes an individual to have a particular sexual orientation, this was generating lots of other questions as well about sexual orientation, and those questions were pointing to variations within the population of heterosexual people and the population of homosexual people. And so I believe that that was where I was going with that comment about increasing pluralism or leading to a more pluralistic view.
All right, thank you. So, people arrive at a homosexuality identity through various routes, correct?
Well, that's my speculation, but I believe it's probably true.
All right, thank you. So some individuals, for example, identify as gay only after multiple homosexual experiences, whereas others form a gay identity without having engaged in homosexual behaviors, correct?
That's correct.
And some women develop a lesbian identity primarily on the basis of feminist political values rather than erotic attractions, correct?
Well, that's a statement that I believe was accurate at the time that I wrote this. I think that that phenomenon, which is sometimes referred to as the political lesbian, a woman who identifies as a lesbian through a sense of political solidarity with lesbians and has an embracing of a feminist ideology, I believe that that was much more common in the 1970s and perhaps in the 1980s than it is today. It probably still does occur, but I don't think it's as widespread as it might have once been.
Is it a true statement for some women?
Well, it was at the time that I wrote this, and I would imagine that there are still some women today who would identify themselves as political lesbians.
Why do you believe that's less common today than it was 20, 30 years ago?
Well, I'm not sure, Your Honor, but I would just say that in a way, it's almost because of the absence of seeing a lot of research on those sorts of women. So at one point, that concept, it showed up in a number of places in different research studies or descriptions of especially lesbian communities. And I just haven't seen it as much in recent times as as was the case in those earlier times. So that's the basis for my speculation that it may not be as common as it once was.
Very well.
Thank you, Your Honor. There is increasing evidence from the research that has been done looking at samples, probability samples of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, that it may very well be the case that this is a population that tends to have a higher educational level on average than heterosexuals, correct?
So is this from the same passage?
No, this is from your deposition transcript.
Oh, okay, good. I was getting lost. Yeah, it may very well be the case that on average, lesbians and gay men in the United States have a higher educational level than comparable heterosexual men and women.
Now, you don't know that we have a really clear understanding of this correlation with education, correct?
Correct. There are reasons that we can speculate. For example, it seems likely that many women who marry heterosexually may leave school, leave college, or not go to college at all in order to do so. Lesbians are less likely to encounter the situation where a relationship would mean that they had to leave school, move to another part of the country to be with their partner, those sort of things. So that's at least one plausible explanation why we might see higher educational levels among lesbians than among heterosexual women. It's also possible that we might see higher levels of education among gay men for a somewhat similar reason, in that they perhaps are not likely to get married at an early age and at an age where they might have to stop going to school in order to take a full-time job or more than one full-time job to support a family. So those are speculations about why there might be that educational discrepancy.
Okay, so those are speculations, correct?
Correct.
But we don't really have a clear understanding of the correlation, correct?
Well, I'm not aware of other data that would exist to explain that.
But the correlation does seem to be a difference that has emerged in a number of different studies, so it seems to be a real difference, correct? The education?
Well, it may very well be a real difference, I believe. In my study, for example, we found higher educational levels than would be expected from comparable heterosexuals among lesbians and gay men. So it seems like it may very well be a real difference, yes.
Okay, thank you. Please turn to tab 35E in the witness binder.
And this is volume 2, right?
Volume 2. And this is a transcript of the proceedings in this court in this trial on January 12th, and this was testimony given by Professor Cott. Are you familiar with Professor Nancy Cott?
I'm not directly familiar with her. I have some sense of who she is.
All right, thank you. You will see on the page I have reproduced of the trial transcript on page 328, line 6, she was asked, question, do you believe that behavior is really infinitely malleable by social circumstances and by culture? And she answers, the witness, just about infinitely yes. Do you agree with that statement?
That behavior is infinitely malleable by social circumstances and by culture?
Well, she qualifies it with just about infinitely.
Just about infinitely? How can you be just about infinitely?
Well, you can go on. The question after that is a question. What is the sole exception of self-preservation? And she says, answer, I think you have to accept that, yes. So that appears to me to be her qualification.
Well, you know, behavior is certainly a very broad topic, and to say that all aspects of behavior are malleable by social circumstances and by culture, I personally would want to think about that one for a while before I would say yes or no. It seems like it's such an all-encompassing statement, and this isn't really something that I have thought about in these terms.
All right. Well, as you sit here now, if you are not able to say yes or no, are you able to say whether this you believe that's an unreasonable statement?
Well, I would assume that Professor Cott had a reason for making it. I just would say that if you were asking me if I agree with that statement, I would have to think about it for a while.
All right, fair enough. Thank you. Please turn to tab 10 in the witness binder. Again, this is the big one.
I thought we were done with the big one.
I'm trying to do this topically, Your Honor, so I'm having to refer back occasionally to
Okay.
one. And this is the this is the article by Professor Badgett. And we have looked at it before.
Yeah, this is the article I haven't seen before.
Yes, by Professor Badgett. We have looked at it before, as you said, but please turn to page 23, and the paragraph that's in the middle of that page, it's the second full paragraph where she writes, further complicating matters, sexual behavior and sexual identities might also be related in some way to economic outcomes or to an individual's socioeconomic class background. From a rational choice perspective, a la Richard Posner, 1992, the choice of a same-sex partner is an outcome determined by individual preferences and budget constraints. According to Posner, factors like high incomes that reduce search costs for sexual partners will increase homosexual sex for men. Do you believe that it's possible that Judge Posner's theory is correct?
I actually don't think I understand Judge Posner's theory on the basis of just that one sentence.
Okay, well, as described here...
Is he saying that men who have strong attractions to other men, if they have a high level of income, might be able to have more sexual partners because that income allows them to travel to places where they might meet more partners or do other things that might let them come into contact with more men who are potential partners? Is that what he's saying?
Well, what she wrote here is it's on the page. It says, from a rational choice perspective, a la Richard Posner, the choice of a same-sex partner is an outcome determined by individual preferences and budget constraints. According to Posner, factors like high incomes that reduce search costs for sexual partners will increase homosexual sex for men. As written, are you essentially unable to understand that? Is that your testimony?
I wouldn't be comfortable commenting on it without understanding exactly what Judge Posner is saying here.
Okay, well, then she goes on to say, a more sociological model of behavior that involves sexual scripts and social networks could have a similar implication. A family's economic status might influence the scripts and networks that individuals eventually operate within, and openness to homosexuality might vary by economic class or other norms correlated with family background. Do you believe that it's possible that that theory described there is correct?
Well, yeah, I think if I'm reading this correctly, in the next sentence she's talking about that correlation of, or the fact that it appears that in the Lauman et al. Study that it was the more educated women and men who were more likely to have same-sex partners and to identify as lesbian, gays, or bisexual. So, I mean, one possibility is that having the higher education leads one to identify or have more sexual partners of the same sex. The other possibility is the one that I was suggesting a moment ago, which is that perhaps people who are lesbian or gay and perhaps bisexual are more likely to pursue a longer term of education. I think I think we have a correlation here, and a correlation is inherently a relationship in which we cannot determine the causal direction without further research.
So that could be correct, this theory as well as the one you posited. Is that what you're saying?
The one that's posited here in the Badgett paper, or the one that I posited?
The one posited in the Badgett paper.
I guess it is stated as a hypothesis that could be tested.
And could it be correct? I mean, do you have any reason, as you sit here today, to say that you believe that could not be correct?
Well, you know, again...
Objection, Your Honor. Calls for speculation.
Maybe you could rephrase, Mr. Nielsen.
As you sit here today, do you have any reason to believe that that statement could not be correct?
Well, as I sit here today, I would have to reiterate that I haven't read this article, and so I'm very reluctant to evaluate a particular sentence that's been pulled out of it this way without having the benefit of understanding the context in which Professor Badgett was offering this hypothesis. So I would just say I can't really say whether it's plausible or not. It may be, but I would really need to have read the entire article to understand exactly what this means. You know, I'd say also this looks to me like an economist's argument, and I'm not an economist, so I would have to, you know, it would be a challenge, I suspect, for me to fully understand this, especially off the cuff like this.
Right. And you read the next sentence that says, the finding by Laumann that more educated women and men are more likely to have had same-sex partners and to identify as LGB could fit either theory. And that's, I guess, referring to the Richard Posner theory and the sociological theory, correct?
I believe that's what she is saying.
All right, thank you. Please turn to tab 29 in the witness binder.
Where do I find it?
The big one.
So this is back at the Garnett's and Peplow article again.
Correct, correct. As you point out, we have looked at this. And let's turn to the bullet points on page 4. And the fourth bullet point says, women's sexual orientation is shaped by such social and cultural factors as women's education, social status and power, economic opportunities, and attitudes about women's roles. Do you agree with that statement?
Well, again, this is another article that I haven't read, and it's a very brief one as well. I would, before commenting on that statement, I would want to read it in more detail and be sure that I understood what research they're basing that particular statement on. So, for example, the idea that women's sexual orientation is shaped by such social and cultural factors such as women's education, I'm not sure if they're talking about that correlation between sexual orientation and level length of education, or if they are talking about some other aspects of education. So, again, it's one that I just really would have trouble commenting on without having read something that elaborated upon this research.
Okay, so as you sit here, you are not able to say whether you agree with that statement or not. Is that correct?
Yeah, I guess I would say that. It may be partly the hour, but I'm finding that I'm having... I would need to look at this more and ideally look at it in a context where they are citing some of the research studies they're talking about.
All right, thank you. And look at the last bullet point underneath it. It says, there is no single developmental pathway leading to a heterosexual, bisexual, or lesbian outcome. Do you agree with that statement?
Well, as I said earlier, I think that it's very likely that we will discover that people have multiple developmental pathways to their adult sexual orientation. So this is certainly consistent with that hypothesis of my own. Okay,
thank you. Please turn to tab 30. And again, this is an article by Professor Peplow.
Yes.
Please look at page 12, if you would. And the first column towards the top of the page, I believe it's the first full paragraph. She writes, in summary, the concept of erotic plasticity is the cornerstone of a new paradigm for understanding women's sexual orientation. Women's sexuality is not tightly scripted by genetic or latest of the four for me, or hormonal influences. Rather, it is responsive throughout the lifespan to a wide variety of cognitive, social, and environmental influences. Do you agree that women's sexuality is not tightly scripted by genetic or hormonal influences?
Well, I believe that this needs to be read in comparison to men's sexuality, which I'm guessing, again, I haven't read this article either, but I'm guessing that Professor Peplow is offering that contrast, as she has in some other papers, and pointing out that as researchers have found, women's sexuality defined broadly, not only in terms of sexual orientation, but in many other aspects, does seem to be more responsive to situational and environmental factors than is the case for men's sexuality. So I would say if you are thinking of this in that if you're thinking of it in that comparison between men and women, that this notion of erotic plasticity, which again, it's broadly defined, it's a more applicable notion to men. To women than to men. I believe that that is accurate based on the research that we have to date.
Right. And she speaks specifically of erotic plasticity as a new paradigm for understanding women's sexual orientation, not just sexuality more broadly understood, correct?
Well, the erotic plasticity concept is about sexuality broadly understood, and I believe she says this is the cornerstone of a new paradigm for understanding women's sexual orientation.
All right, thank you. And now she goes on, as you will see, she talks about she talks about the variety and nature of women's romantic and sexual relationships. And at the bottom of page 13 in the first column, she says, one implication of this research is that the very concept of sexual orientation may be misguided. Do you think that there is any chance that that could be correct?
Well, again, I haven't read this paper before, so I'm very reluctant to evaluate sentences taken out of context. I would say in some of her other work, Professor Papalow has focused on that word sexual in orientation and has pointed to the concept that I was talking about at the beginning of the day of sexual orientation being very much a relational construct. And so it may very well be the case that in this article, where she's going with this is to say the focus on sexuality is perhaps something that works better when you're trying to understand men's experience than women's. And when you are looking at women's experience, it might be better to take this construct of sexual orientation and understand it in terms of relationships, and that might be a more helpful view. And I believe what she's trying to do here and in some of her other papers is to offer an alternative way of thinking about sexuality that might be useful to researchers.
All right, thank you. Please turn to tab 15. Again, this is by Professor Papalow.
And the big one?
In the big book. And we've looked at this before, and please turn to page 81. And on page 81, I would like you to look at the bottom of the first full paragraph, and she writes, available evidence indicates that biological contributions to the development of sexual orientation in women are minimal. Do you agree with that statement?
Well, as she says at the beginning of the paragraph, more than 50 years of research has failed to demonstrate that biological factors are a major influence in the development of women's sexual orientation. And I would say that we also can say that to some extent, we can also say that to some extent about the development of men's sexual orientation. As I have said before, we don't really understand the origins of sexual orientation in men or in women. There are many different competing theories, some biologically based, others based more on culture and individual experience. So I would say that what she is suggesting is that the available evidence doesn't support the idea of there being a strong biological factor that explains the development of sexual orientation in women.
Do you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree that that is the case. And I would also say that I believe that it's the case that we simply don't understand the origins of sexual orientation in either men or women.
Okay. Please turn to page 87 of the same document, and under an alternative perspective, that heading, do you see that towards the bottom of the page on page 87?
Yes.
She writes, a comprehensive analysis of women's sexual orientation should begin with empirically grounded generalizations about women's experiences. The cumulative record of research on women's sexual orientation supports three broad conclusions. First, there is no inevitable association between masculinity variously defined in women's sexual orientation. Associations may exist in particular cultural contexts, but are not a necessary component of sexual orientation. Second, the impact of biological factors in determining women's sexual orientation appears to be weak or non-existent. And third, cross-cultural and historical analyses demonstrate that women's erotic and romantic bonds can take diverse forms that are shaped by their social environment. Do you disagree with any of those conclusions?
Well, we just discussed the second one about the biological factors.
Right.
As I was saying, the evidence there is, frankly, some people would not say it's weak, but it is certainly not conclusive at all.
Do you have
The
sorry?
I'm looking at the three statements again. And the idea that women's erotic and romantic bonds can be affected by their social environment, yes, I think we already talked about that. So yes, I would say that I would agree with these statements.
Okay, thank you. And please turn to page 92, same document. The author is right. In the U.S., Gagnon, 1980, suggested that the creation of visible urban gay and lesbian communities made the choice of a same-sex lifestyle more attractive to wider audiences.
I'm sorry, where? I see. I see.
And there is a quote, which you can read if you like, but I'm going to move on to right after that. And after the quote, they say, Gagnon suggested that one consequence may be to increase the demographic and personality diversity of those participating in same-sex relations. Now, do you believe the creation of visible urban gay and lesbian communities may have had this effect?
Well, I will say it yet again. This is another paper that I believe I may have read it in the past, but not recently. I believe that what Gagnon might have been saying here is that there may be individuals who have same-sex desires and attractions and perhaps even engage in same-sex sexual behavior on occasion, but in the time before the emergence of visible gay communities in cities may not have even known that there was a label to describe people like themselves, and may not have known that this was that there really was such a thing as sexual orientation, or that it was possible to be gay. And so I would speculate, and I am speculating because I haven't read this, that perhaps Professor Gagnon was saying that for those sorts of individuals, the existence of visible gay communities would allow those sorts of individuals to realize that there were other people like them, and that it might be possible to find those other people and develop a community with them.
Okay, thank you. Please turn to tab 14, if you would. And again, this is another article by Professor Peplau that we have looked at.
How are we doing, Mr. Nielsen?
We are getting there, Your Honor.
Oh, good. I'm sorry, which tab again?
It's tab 14.
Okay.
And please turn to page 332, and you'll find in bold a heading, The Fluidity of Women's Sexuality, and italics, Influence of the Social Environment. And under that, in the last paragraph, you'll find, partway down, it says, consider the link between education and sexual orientation. The National Health and Social Life Survey, which, again, is the Lohman survey we have discussed, found that completing college doubled the likelihood that a man identified as gay or bisexual, but was associated with a 900% increase in the percentage of women identifying as lesbian or bisexual. Are you familiar with those statistics?
Not with the specific statistics, but this gets back to the correlation we've been discussing, which indicates that lesbians and gay men are likely to have had more years of education than comparable heterosexuals.
Right, thank you. And please turn to page 336. And the very first sentence on the page under heading Sociocultural Influences on Women's Sexual Orientation reads, there is mounting research evidence that the patterning of women's sexuality and sexual orientation varies across time and place. Do you agree with that?
I'm just taking a moment to read the paragraph. Well, again, I think this is something we have already discussed, in that she's talking about different cultures, but also even within our own culture, different racial and ethnic groups, socioeconomic groups, the experience of being in those different groups having an effect on one's sexuality and how one understands oneself as a sexual being. So I would agree with it in that sense.
All right, thank you. Please turn to page 337, the second full paragraph. Professor Peplau writes, as another example, living in same-sex institution also tends to increase the likelihood of romantic and erotic relationships between women. Do you agree with that statement?
Well, As she points out, there was a 1929 study of graduates of women's colleges in which women reported that they had had an intense emotional relationship with another woman in college. And she also talks about same-sex relationships occurring in prison populations, which are sex segregated. So it may very well be the case that in those particular settings, people are more likely to engage in same-sex behavior and possibly to form bonds that are based on that sort of behavior.
All right, thank you. Please turn to tab 36 in the little binder. And can you identify this document, Professor Herrera?
Sorry, I haven't got it yet. Okay, this is an article that was published in the Journal of Gay and Lesbian Mental Health in 2008. It's titled Masculinity, Femininity, and the Development of Sexual Orientation in Women. And the authors are Letitia Ann Peplau and Mark Huppen.
All right, thank you. And can you turn to page 156? And I believe this discusses the survey that you referenced there.
Page 156?
156, yes. And towards the bottom of the carryover paragraph, it reads, during the same time period.
Oh, right, yes. This is referring back to the same thing that was mentioned in the other article that we just finished with.
Right.
Yeah.
And she found that 42% of the sample, quote, during the same time period, American researcher Catherine Davies, 1929, mailed a questionnaire about sexuality to 2,000 graduates of women's colleges in the United States. The questionnaire asked, have you at any time experienced intense emotional relations with other women? 42% of the sample replied that they had. Of these, 52% said that the relationship was sexual in character. In other words, 1 woman in 5 reported a sexual relationship with a best woman friend in college. Although some of these women continued to have intimate relationships with women after college, most did not, end quote. Are you familiar with that study? You are familiar, correct?
The 1929 study by Catherine Davis?
Yes.
I haven't read it. I've run across references to it.
Okay, thank you. And Your Honor, I would like to offer DIX 1237 into evidence.
No objection.
Very well. 1237 is admitted.
Okay, thank you. Please turn to tab 37 in the witness binder. Can you identify this document? It should be pre-marked DIX 1254.
This is a document from the journal. I believe it's the journal is Health and Human Rights. The document is commentary titled Torture and Ill Treatment Based on Sexual Identity, the Roles and Responsibilities of Health Professionals and Their Institutions. The authors are Simon Lewin and Ilan Meyer.
Okay, thank you. Are you familiar with the authors?
I don't know who Simon Lewin is. I'm familiar with Ilan Meyer. I've never seen this article before.
Okay, thank you. And please turn to page 163. In the bottom paragraph, partway through the paragraph, it says, although human rights work requires the identification of a person as a subject of rights, social science research has suggested that sexual identities are socially constructed. And do you agree with that statement? Well, let's take the second half. Do you agree with the statement that social science research has suggested that sexual identities are socially constructed?
Well, that certainly has been suggested.
Do you think that's an unreasonable suggestion?
Well, as I said earlier, I think that you have to look at the social constructions perspective from the group standpoint, and in that regard, if it points you to looking at cultural influence and cultural variation, that's a very useful perspective. I don't believe that the social constructions perspective works very well when you try to apply it to the specific experience of the individual. And as far as this statement goes, I'm not, as I said, I have not seen this article before, so I don't understand the context in which they are making this statement, except that they seem to be talking about the fact that, and I'm guessing this, that people who are lesbian, gay, or bisexual, and perhaps transgender as well, face oppression and even torture in some societies and some countries. And I'm guessing that the author thinks that's bad, but I don't know the context in which this particular statement was being made.
Right, thank you. And Your Honor, I would like to offer DIX 1254.
No objection, Your Honor.
Very well.
All right, thank you. Professor Herrera, please turn to tab 38 in the witness binder, and you will find a document pre-marked DIX 1278. Can you identify that document?
Well, it's a reprint of a web page, it appears to be, from the American Psychiatric Association, and the title on it is Healthy Minds, Healthy Lives.
Thank you. And if you turn to the first page of the printout after you have the addresses under gay, lesbian, bisexuals, and under what causes homosexuality, heterosexuality, bisexuality, partway through that sentence, partway through that paragraph, you find a sentence that reads, however, to date, there are no replicated scientific studies supporting any specific biological etiology for homosexuality. And you agree with that, correct?
Well, I would say that I'm not sufficiently familiar with the research literature to say that there are absolutely no replicated biological studies, but I would agree with the statement at the beginning of the paragraph, which says no one knows what causes heterosexuality, homosexuality, or bisexuality.
Right. And are you aware of any replicated scientific studies that do support a specific biological etiology for homosexuality?
Well, I have a sense that there might be some, but this is not something that I prepared for in terms of coming today. But as I said, I would certainly agree with the statement that we don't know what the origins are of sexual orientation.
Okay, thank you. And, Your Honor, I would like to offer DIX 1278 into evidence.
No objection, Your Honor.
I beg your pardon.
No objection.
Very well. 1278 is in.
Thank you. Let's turn to tab 41. I'm going to skip a little bit here, and you'll find a document pre-marked DIX 642. Can you identify that?
I'm going to mispronounce the names. The first author is A.F. I'm guessing it's pronounced J-O-R-M, Jorm, and there are several other authors. The title of this is Cohort Difference in Sexual Orientation Results from a Large Age-Stratified Population Sample. And this appears to have been published in the journal Gerontology in 2003, and these authors are located in Australia.
All right, thank you. Now, this study found that women in recent birth cohorts in the United States, Britain, and Australia were more likely to report having a female sexual partner during adulthood. And you'll see that on 392 and 393 if you look at the introduction. And on page 393...
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Again, this is not a paper I have reviewed. When it says they were more likely to report having female sexual partners during adulthood, more likely than what or whom?
Older age cohorts.
Oh, I see. Okay.
All right. And if you look at the second full paragraph on 393 in the authors conclude, these findings suggest a major cohort effect in same-gender sexual behavior and perhaps also in sexual orientation. If a cohort effect in sexual orientation exists, it has implications for purely biological theories of sexual orientation because there must be historical changes in environmental factors that account for such an effect. And do you believe that that's an unreasonable conclusion?
I believe that's a hypothesis one could make. I would offer rather an alternative hypothesis. Just if I were sitting down to read this oral article, the first thing that would come to my mind is that people who grew up in the 1920s and the 1930s and the early part of the 20th century would have been growing up in a time where there was very strong repression against people who were lesbian or gay, and in fact when there wasn't much open discussion of sexuality at all. And so I would say that it would be a reasonable hypothesis to say that these age cohort effects might be due to the differing levels of stigma experienced by people in different age cohorts, so that older people might be extremely reluctant to disclose a same-sex attraction or homosexual behavior or being lesbian, gay, or bisexual than would people in newer cohorts, more recent cohorts.
Okay, so that's an alternative hypothesis. But do you believe that the hypothesis suggested by these authors is unreasonable?
Well, I assume that they're going to test it, although, again, I haven't read this article. It's not an unreasonable hypothesis to pose, and for all I know, again, not having read this article, sometimes authors pose a hypothesis that they actually expect to disprove in the course of the study, that may be the case here. I just don't know because I haven't read the paper.
All right, Your Honor, I would like to offer DIX 642.
No objection, Your Honor.
642 is in.
All right, thank you. Now, you mentioned in your direct testimony the Williams Institute study about a survey of same-sex couples in Massachusetts, correct?
Well, the Williams Institute, I believe researchers from there wrote the report. I believe it was carried out by the Massachusetts Department of Public Health.
All right, thank you. Now, apart from that, all the studies that you relied on in finding that marriage had physical and mental health benefits, in all of those studies, marriage referred to legal marriage recognized by the state, correct?
Yeah, I'm pausing because I believe that in many cases they simply asked people if they were married. I'm not sure that they provided that sort of definition to the respondents. They simply asked them their marital status, but that would be implicit in it, yes.
All right. And in all the studies on which you relied, this has always been heterosexual marriage, correct?
In those studies, yes.
Thank you. And with respect to the physical and mental health outcomes that you say are associated with marriage, you do not believe there have been studies published that compared heterosexual married couples with same-sex married couples, correct?
That is correct, to the best of my knowledge.
And can you name any tangible benefits that matter that would be available to married couples that are not available for domestic partnership couples in California? Tangible.
Objection, Your Honor. I'm sorry.
I beg your pardon.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. I'm going to object to the extent the question calls for a legal conclusion.
Have you finished the question?
The question is whether the witness can identify any tangible benefits that would be available to a married couple that are not available for a domestic partnership couple in California.
The objection's overruled.
Well, I would say that I'm not a legal scholar, so I don't know about the law. I am vaguely familiar with the fact that there are some differences between domestic partnerships and marital relationships in California. I would say that in terms of tangible benefits, meaning money, inheritance rights, that sort of thing, that you don't see the difference there. You see the difference more in the intangible and symbolic meaning of being married and the what may be intangible and yet real consequences of perhaps having a more stable, long-enduring relationship that might be associated with the label of marriage.
All right.
For tangible benefits, I would not be able to name them.
Okay, thank you. You talked a little bit about hate crimes. Are hate crimes illegal in California?
I think crime is illegal in California.
Correct. And are crimes committed on the basis of sexual orientation illegal in California?
Yes, they are illegal in California, and in fact, they still continue to occur.
And do you believe that there is a link between denying or between defining a marriage as a union of a man and a woman in hate crimes?
Well, I think that it's, as I said earlier, when we look at structural stigma related to sexual orientation, it provides a context in which all sorts of things happen, all sorts of behaviors, towards people in that stigmatized group. And so I would say that a direct relationship between those two is not empirically established to my knowledge, but that structural stigma as basically creating the atmosphere in which individual enactments of stigma occur, that there is potentially a relationship there, yes.
And, Your Honor, I believe I am concluded, but I just want to quickly consult FMA for just a moment.
Very well. I hope we get good news.
Okay, Your Honor, I am happy to report that we have no further questions.
Very well. Mr. Dettmer, redirect.
Thank you, Your Honor. I will try to be brief. Good evening, Professor Herrich. There were a series of questions this morning about the definition of sexual orientation that researchers such as yourself might use. Do you research those questions?
Yes.
Okay, now I believe you explained that the different aspects, the three different aspects of sexual orientation, will depend upon what the researcher is researching. Is that correct?
Correct. Using the appropriate operational definition would depend on the goals of the research.
If I could ask for 17, please. Professor Herrich, if you could turn to tab 12 in the large binder, if you look at page 24.
I'm sorry, which tab?
I'm sorry, tab 12. I'm sorry, this is the large binder that Mr. Nielsen showed you?
Oh. Very sorry. Looking at the wrong thing. Okay.
Actually, if you want to just look at the screen, that would be super. I have put up the text there as well. This is from page 24 of tab 12. It says, so what is the correct definition of the LGB population? The answer depends on the purpose of the study. A researcher who is interested in risks for HIV/AIDS among men who have sex with men, MSMs, might focus on behavioral definitions because behavior affects risk exposure regardless of personal identity. A researcher who is interested in developmental milestones of gay youth might focus on identity definitions because development of a gay identity is a core task facing the youth. Thus, there is not one answer to the question. It is the researcher's intellectual responsibility to answer this question with reasoned justification. The researcher must define the population on the basis of the study's objectives and its underlying conceptual framework. Is that consistent with your understanding of the technical definition that you've given of sexual orientation?
Yes, it's very consistent with that.
Are there any other examples you can give of how those three different aspects might be applied?
Yeah. Okay, well, he's got HIV and AIDS in there, developmental milestones. Now he was talking about, for example, if you want to look at discrimination and its impact, you might look at identity definitions. Yeah, you know, at this hour of the day, I would be hard-pressed to come up with more examples than that. So.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Now, if I could ask for a demonstrative 18, please. And the question is, Professor Herrera, that definitional issue that researchers, social science researchers, come up with isn't limited to sexual orientation, is it? It also comes up in other contexts?
Stop there before it becomes more compound.
I was just going to refer Professor Herrera to the demonstrative, Your Honor.
Okay, I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Maybe I'll rephrase the question at His Honor's suggestion. Do social science researchers who are researching issues other than sexual orientation have the same definitional issues?
Well, yes, I believe I stated earlier, and you know, I see it here in this, what I guess is a quote from the Dean and Meyer paper. You know, when we talk about race, for example, there is something that can be difficult to define. I mean, for some people it's very clear, but for other people they may come from a mixed racial background, and it's a question of which part of their family or which part of their ancestry they most identify with and label themselves. Their skin color may not be very revealing of them belonging to one race or another. They may develop an identity as a member of one race or the other race or as a mixed race individual. So no, sexual orientation is certainly not the only area in which things get pretty messy when we are trying to study them.
Okay. And just for the record's sake, the last part of the quotation that I have put up from its tab 13, pages 134 and 135, it says, not surprisingly, these difficulties mirror similar problems that have been recognized and examined relating to the classification of people based on race and ethnicity. Is that what you're referring to, Professor Herrera?
Yes.
That same problem?
Yes.
And in fact, we spent a lot of time this morning talking about labels that people apply, and whether certain labels apply to different groups of sexual minorities. Is that right?
Correct.
Would the same label issue come up with respect to racial or ethnic minorities?
Oh, well, certainly. If we just look back even in our relatively brief history of just, say the past 100 years, we see that many different terms have been used or have come into favor and gone out of favor for describing a particular racial or ethnic groups. So again, there has been change and evolution in that area as well.
And similarly, we talked about the identity that gay men and lesbians may have with the gay and lesbian community. Do you remember that discussion this morning?
It seems like a long time ago, yes.
Would those same issues of strength of identification with a community be present when you're talking about racial groups as well?
Yes, and in fact, I think that some of the research on lesbian and gay identity has borrowed from previous research on racial and ethnic minority identities as a starting point, a way to try to think about the phenomena.
Now, back to sexual orientation. There was a lot of discussion this morning about the circumstances in which the three different aspects that you mentioned, behavior, attraction, and identity, a lot of discussion about when those three are not in when they don't overlap. Do you remember that testimony?
Yes, when they don't match up, yes.
Is it your understanding or is it your opinion that those three definitions overlap for the vast majority of people?
Well, as I think I've said several times today, for the vast majority of people, we do see consistency across those three different aspects of sexual orientation.
And how do you know that?
Well, I will go back again to the Lauman and Gagnon study, which is a very good study. And again, they found that roughly 90% of their participants matched heterosexual on all three of those aspects of sexual orientation. And another, I believe, it was roughly 2% of the sample matched it on lesbian, gay, and bisexual identity, attraction, and behavior. And then the rest of the sample was where their, things weren't so neat. It didn't all match up.
Now, taking this out of the research context of what how researchers define sexual orientation, I think you testified earlier that you have asked many people who are not social scientists what their sexual orientation is. Is that correct?
Yes, in various surveys and questionnaire studies.
Do you have any estimation of how many people you've asked that question of through surveys or otherwise?
Well, thousands.
Is it your opinion that most people can answer that question intelligently?
It's my opinion that most people can answer that question based not only on my research, but on other research as well. For example, in the Lauman and Gagnon study, they pointed this out as well, that most people were able to answer the question. They did have a problem. Some people didn't seem to understand the word heterosexual, but they understood straight. So part of it is asking the question in the right way with the correct language, but yes, most people can answer the question.
Now, there were a long series of questions today about, well, actually, let me ask you a different question first. There were a series of questions about identifying the causes of sexual orientation. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Now, even if you don't know what causes sexual orientation, does that change your opinion that some people are straight, some people are gay, some people are lesbian?
And some people are bisexual. Yes, I don't see those two as being related, inherently related to each other.
Do you find that, do you have an opinion about whether most people are consistent in their sexual orientation over time?
Well, again, I would go back to the Lauman and Gagnon study and point out that it suggests that people tend to be. And as I believe I've said, I think if you are a betting person, the best bet is that a person, if you don't know anything else about them, to assume that they probably will be consistent in the future, provided that, for example, they're going to be actually engaging in having sex, that having sex would be consistent with their current identity. For some people, that's not how it works, obviously, but I would say that the pattern is that people tend to be consistent.
And can you characterize the proportion of people who are consistent in their sexual orientation?
Well, again, I go back to the Lauman and Gagnon and say that there it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 92%, realizing that there have been instances in the past, especially for lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, where they may have had a period in which they did engage in heterosexual behavior. But especially when we talk about identity and attractions, I think that we see a great deal of consistency there for many, many people.
Now, you mentioned a couple times that there is a continuum, that the concept of a continuum is a useful way to think about sexual orientation. Why do you say that?
Well, because the concept of the continuum alerts us to the fact that we have to be careful about those categories, that there are, in fact, these instances of individuals who don't fit neatly into the category of heterosexual or gay or lesbian. And this is where Kinsey's work was useful, I think, in sensitizing us to the idea that people would have varying levels of sexual attraction and experience towards men or toward women, and not to simply think of it in black and white terms. And I think that gets us closer to reality, so that's why it's very useful.
Okay. Does that concept that you've just described, does it change your opinion that people do not choose their sexual orientation?
Well, some people in my study said that they did feel that they had some degree of choice about their sexual orientation, but they were certainly in the minority. Among gay men only, in the national sample, only about 5% said that they felt they had any significant degree of choice about their sexual orientation. And for lesbians, it was somewhere between 10 and 20% who said they felt they had some degree of choice, and it was somewhat more for bisexuals. So there are some people who say that they perceive a degree of choice about their sexual orientation, but in my research, the majority did not.
Now, I want to ask you about some of the specific writings that you were asked to look at earlier today.
Okay.
Mr. Nielsen referred to a number of studies authored by Professor Diamond. Do you remember those studies?
Yes.
Do the portions of those studies that you read cast any doubt on your opinion that for the vast majority of people, the three different aspects of sexual orientation, attraction, behavior, and identity overlap?
Well, I believe that what Lisa Diamond did in her research was she looked at a sample of people who had a high likelihood of not necessarily overlapping over a period of time. And so I don't want to in any way sound like I'm denigrating her research. I think it's very useful, but she also made it very clear in her book and in her various articles that this was not a representative sample, that you couldn't use these data to generalize about the entire population. But what she was trying to do was to document that this plasticity does occur, especially for some women. And I think to try to help us to better understand for those women in whom this occurs exactly how it happens.
There are also a number of studies that you looked at from Professor Peplau, specifically I think in tab 14 of the large binder. I'm not going to ask you to look at it again, although I do want to bring up one portion of that document. If I could ask 19, please. And let me just read this into the record. This is from page 333 of tab 14, which is defendants 1, 2, 3, 5. It says, quote, claims about the potential erotic plasticity of women do not mean that most women will actually exhibit change over time. At a young age, many women adopt patterns of heterosexuality that are stable across their lifetime. Some women adopt enduring patterns of same-sex attractions and relationships, end quote. Is that consistent with your understanding of Professor Peplau's theory regarding plasticity?
Yes.
Is it also consistent with your own understanding?
Yes.
Now, are you familiar with a person named Daniel Robinson, a college professor?
I became familiar with his name in the course of this case, but otherwise I was not aware of him.
If I could ask for exhibit, demonstrative number 20. This is 3 lines from Professor Robinson's deposition in this case. And just so you know, Professor Robinson was an expert hired by the defendant interveners, the proponents of Proposition 8.
Your Honor, I'm going to object to that, at least to preserve our objection. We withdrew him before the start of trial.
I cannot hear you.
I'm going to object to this. We withdrew Professor Robinson before the start of trial, so I want to state my objection.
Your Honor, I believe Professor Robinson lives in either England or Maryland and is thus farther than 100 miles from the courthouse. And I believe under FRCP 32, we may use his deposition for any purpose.
Very well. Proceed.
The testimony I'm asking you to look at, Professor Herrera, says, the question is, question. Now, do you believe that sexual orientation is readily subject to change? The answer from Professor Robinson is, answer, no. Is that consistent with your understanding of whether sexual orientation is readily subject to change?
I would give the same response.
Now, there were a series of questions that you were asked about sexual orientation change therapy or reparative therapy. Do you remember those?
Yes.
And I would like to, again, put up testimony from Professor Robinson. This is number 21, please. And I will read it into the record. Question, were you aware at the time you did your report that the APA reached that conclusion? Answer, yes. In fact, I have noted often the refractory nature of homosexuality to any kind of therapeutic intervention, and therefore, it wouldn't be at all surprising that enduring changes would not be common.
Again, just a continuing objection.
Very well. The deposition was taken in the course of the litigation.
I guess my understanding is they are offering him as their own witness.
No, Your Honor. We are simply reading his deposition into the record, a portion of it. Question. And you have not found enduring change as a result of therapy to be common? Professor Robinson's answer, no, it's not common. It's not reported to be common. Is that consistent with your understanding of the state of the research on sexual orientation change therapy?
Yes, it is consistent with my understanding.
Now, you were also asked several questions about Professor Spitzer's work having to do with this type of therapy. Do you remember that?
Yes.
So let me put up another excerpt from Professor Robinson's deposition. This is 22, please. The question. A question, okay. So when you make a statement, homosexuality is no more immutable than those identities one takes on in various walks and works of life, you don't limit that to a group where there's 93% of people deeply religious and 78% of people who are on speaking engagements, often at churches. Is it appropriate, in your view, to take a finding in that one limited type of sample and apply it generally as you do in your report? Answer. If my statement about the immutability of homosexuality were tied exclusively to Spitzer's research or anything like it, then indeed it would be an implausible inference. Do you see that?
Yes, I see that.
Do you know what is referred in the question about the 93% of people deeply religious and 78% of people who are on speaking engagements, often at churches?
Well, I'm not sure that I would recall the exact percentages, but I believe that those are the characteristics of the sample that Dr. Spitzer used in his study, whom he recruited mainly through groups that are supportive of and promoting reparative therapy. And he did comment either in the paper or in his he wrote a later response to some of the criticism, or perhaps even in the press, that he was aware of that the members of this sample, it was a very, very religious group of people, and that they were also very strongly involved in these organizations that promote reparative therapy. And he thought that that was an important qualification on his findings, suggesting that these same findings would not be observed perhaps for a group of people who didn't match his sample in terms of their religious beliefs and their activities related to reparative therapy.
Turning to a slightly different topic, Mr. Nielsen had you look at Exhibit PX912, which is the study by John Gonsiorek and James Weinrich, the definition and scope of sexual orientation. And he asked you questions about a line in that study saying, there is little unanimity about the use of the words lesbian and gay as opposed to homosexual. Do you remember that questioning?
Sort of vaguely.
Okay, if I could ask for 23, please. This is another excerpt from that same document. It says, we suggested the term sexual preference as misleading, as it assumes conscious or deliberate choice and may trivialize the depth of the psychological processes involved. We recommend the term sexual orientation because most of research findings indicate that homosexual feelings are a basic part of an individual's psyche and are established much earlier than conscious choice would indicate. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do.
Now, you may recall that some of the deposition testimony from two of the plaintiffs in this case was read to you. Do you remember that?
Yes.
I want to put up 30, please. And this is trial testimony from our plaintiff, Chris Perry, in this case. And she says in this trial, she was asked, question, and tell me what that means in your own words. What does it mean to be a lesbian? The answer that Miss Perry gave was, answer, well, for me, what it means is I have always felt strong attraction and interest in women and formed really close relationships with women. And I have only ever fallen in love with women. And the happiest I feel is in my relationship with Sandy and because I'm in love with her. Is that testimony consistent with your understanding of what it means to be a lesbian?
Well, it seems to have all of those elements of attraction and desire, as well as apparently behavior and the relationship and the self-labeling. So yes, I would say that this is consistent with what I was saying about what constitutes sexual orientation in general, and in this case, lesbianism.
And I'm going to put up some more of Miss Perry's trial testimony. 31, please. She was asked in this trial, question, do you feel that in the past you could have developed the same kind of bond with a man? Miss Perry's answer was, I was unable to do that. I, as I said, grew up in Bakersfield, California, and it was in the 70s and 80s. And all of my friends, as we were getting older and they were beginning to date, became more and more interested in boys. And I recognized that that was something that would have been the best thing for me to do if I could. And I did date few boys because it did make life easier, you know. Then I would have a date to go to the prom to, or I could go to a party to. But as I got a little bit older, it became clear to me that I didn't feel the same way my friends did about boys, and that there was something different about me. Is that consistent with your understanding of the coming out process?
Yeah, and I think it's consistent with some of what I said earlier about the idea that many lesbians and gay men at some point in their lives, especially during adolescence or young adulthood, often will try to have a relationship with someone who's of the other sex, and that this may include sexual contact as well. But I think that what this quote suggests is that she may have tried to do that, but it just didn't work for her, and she recognized that her attractions were to women.
I have one more excerpt from Miss Perry's testimony in this trial. 32, please. Miss Perry was asked, question, do you feel that you were born with those feelings, with that kind of sexual orientation? Her answer was, yes, I do. Question, do you feel it could change in the future? Do you have a sense that it might somehow change? Her answer was, I'm 45 years old. I don't think so. Is that testimony consistent with your understanding of the constancy of sexual orientation?
Yeah, in terms of the constancy, I would say that, the question about whether one is born with feelings, this is something we don't know. One can have that subjective sense. Now, this doesn't address the question of really what are the origins of sexual orientation, but the idea of believing that this is a constant in one's life. And I think it's reasonable to expect that by the age of 45, when one is in a committed relationship, one probably does have a pretty good sense of the constancy of where their life is likely to go in the future.
Just a couple more questions, and this goes to defining gay men and lesbians. If two women want to marry each other, is it a reasonable assumption that they are lesbians?
I think it's a reasonable assumption, yes.
Okay, and if two men want to marry each other, is it a reasonable assumption that they're gay?
Yes.
I have no more questions, Your Honor.
Very well. Thank you. And thank you, Professor Herrich. I think you win the long distance award. Very well. With respect to the Robinson deposition, Mr. Nielsen, you can, of course, offer excerpts under 32A6 if you wish to do so. You can get those in on Monday. That would be fine. And let's see. Mr. Boutros, you said you had about 90 minutes?
Yes, Your Honor.
I gather you're prepared to do that on Monday morning?
We'll be prepared first thing Monday morning, Your Honor.
That means then, with the exception of perhaps organizing exhibits and so forth, the plaintiffs will rest.
Exactly.
All right. Then who is to be the first witness we're going to hear on the other side?
Your Honor, we are not sure who will be first, but it will either be Dr. Ken Miller or Mr. David Blankenhorn.
Very well. Well, it would be helpful if you give me the other side, an idea of what's going to happen. Usually they're both going to testify on Monday. Will we get all of their testimony complete?
We will identify 48 hours beforehand which one it will be. We honestly just haven't decided yet, but we will do so tomorrow morning.
Have a nice weekend, I guess is the comment. Mr. Boies, you are gesturing.
No, I was just trying to count when 48 hours was, Your Honor. I actually thought that the agreement was that for the first witness we would have more time, which is what we gave them. So I thought actually we were going to get more than 48 hours notice of the first witness, but it will be what it will be.
Do I understand you're planning you're planning to present only two witnesses?
Two witnesses, Your Honor, two expert witnesses. We may well call another witness primarily for the purpose of authenticating documents.
Okay. Is that one of the proponents?
No, not one of the proponents.
Well, I guess on the plaintiff's team, you better be ready for both of those witnesses, Miller and
Mr. Blankenhorn.
Blankenhorn, yes.
As I say, I think we will resolve that this evening and let our friends for the plaintiffs know tomorrow morning.
All right. Well, have a pleasant weekend, everybody. Anything further? All right.